Welcome to part 4 in my series on Freemasonry. Anyone interested in the subject of history can't help but be fascinated with the world of ancient Egypt. I've got an interest in all kinds of books and stories about ancient Egypt, not only because of my interest in history in general, but also because the world of the ancient Egyptians was intimately connected to the world of ancient Canaan and Palestine. Something else that I like to get is this magazine. I have a subscription to the Biblical Archaeology Review. It's a great magazine. This month's cover story is all about a particular Egyptian tomb. I really like studying about ancient Egyptian culture and beliefs because it informs my understanding of the Bible, which is a subject that I really love, the whole world of the Bible as it existed so long ago. Well, a few years ago, when I was down in Miami, I picked something up at the mysterious Coral Castle with my dad down in Miami, Florida. He knew of my interest in Egyptology, and so he bought this for me at the gift shop. It's a little pyramid, and inside it's got some of my treasures hidden. But the real pyramids in Egypt are home to even greater treasures of knowledge. Upon the walls of some of Egypt's oldest pyramids are ancient inscriptions known as the pyramid texts. And these are dated to around 2400 BC, and some of them tell the tale of the murder of a god named Osiris. The Osiris myth is the single most influential story in ancient Egyptian mythology. It's the story of an ancient god king who was slain by Set, his jealous brother who was coveting the throne of Osiris. The story details how Queen Isis, who was both the sister and the wife of Osiris, was able to restore vitality to her husband's deceased body, enabling him to help her conceive a son, who was named Horus. Well, Isis protects this child from constant threats until he reaches maturity and can challenge Set for his father's throne. And after his eventual victory, Horus completes the process of resurrecting his father, Osiris, from the dead. Well, historians and Egyptologists are really unable to say when this tale was first formed, thousands and thousands of years ago. But through these pyramid texts, the Osiris myth has persisted long after most of the ancient knowledge of Egypt and their beliefs have been lost to time. Other stories about Osiris teach that he caused vegetation to grow in Egypt by flooding the Nile River each year, which kept the people alive. Osiris was the judge of the dead. He was also the god of the underworld. So from these various beliefs sprang up ancient Egyptian mystery cults that taught sacred knowledge about how the acolytes could participate in various initiation rituals and ceremonies that would connect them to the resurrection power of Osiris, which would bridge the gulf that would lead them from life through death into the afterlife safely. Well, centuries passed, and by 2000 BC, these Egyptian mystery teachings had found their way into ancient Greece. And like Osiris himself, the mystery cults experienced a rebirth and infusion with new life. And one of the more prominent of these cults was the Dionysian mysteries. These ancient Greek and later Roman rituals served to liberate worthy initiates and cause them to experience transcendental evolution of the spirit to prepare them for the afterlife. See, this came from the Egyptian teachings. To help them achieve this mystical state, the Dionysian cults used wine and other intoxicants, and they used other trance-inducing techniques like rhythmic dancing and music to liberate the individual. And once the inhibitions were removed from the individual, these cultists engaged in all kinds of orgiastic activities. Well, the Romans, who of course embraced Greek culture, including its pantheon of gods and mystery cults, the Romans kept the ancient teachings and practices alive. And one of the most prominent of the Roman mystery cults was the cult of Mithras. Their teachings are known as the Mithraic mysteries. The original word for Mithras actually comes from ancient Akkad, and it means contract. Mithras was an Indo-Iranian deity. He was the god of contracts, order, and friendship. Well, this later Romanized cult of Mithras was a secret order. It spread quickly throughout the entire Roman Empire. Tons of people were in this. Worshippers tried to hide their activities from the general public, though, by meeting in caves and other secret locations. And this was partly for the purpose of creating a feeling of exclusivity. Members of the cult were expected to swear to secrecy of all of their activities and teachings. Well, like the Greek and Egyptian mystery cults before it, Mithraism focused its rituals on fertility and death and resurrection. This mystery cult built hundreds of temples that stretched all the way from Britain in the west over to Syria, just hundreds of them. Well, the secret cult of Mithras reached its peak in the first 3 centuries AD, but when Christianity was made the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Mithras mystery cults began to quickly vanish. But the key point here is that the teachings about death and rebirth that were common to the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Roman mystery schools, those didn't disappear. They were adopted by early Christian mysticists who, of course, modified the teachings using their own religious stories as molds into which these ancient esoteric teachings and wisdoms were poured. The process of looking at matters of spiritual faith from different perspectives like that's not something that was uncommon in the Hellenistic age. In fact, it was actually quite popular among many early Christians of both Jewish and Gentile origin. Because Jewish mysticism was already established and growing during this period, many of the early Jewish converts of the Hellenistic age saw Christianity really just as an extension of their existing mystic worldview. So go back in history to 800 to 500 BC. Ancient Judaism back then was predominantly prophetic in nature. You had the teachings of prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel, but following this came centuries of apocalyptic Judaism, where they were focused on speculations about the nature of heaven and the coming end of age. But it was between it was during the temple period, the Second Temple period, from about 200 BC to 100 AD, that Judaism began to incorporate more mystical elements into its faith. And this is when the sect called the Essenes became prominent. And one of the primary Jewish mystery schools of the time, they taught Merkaba, or chariot mysticism. These mystic teachings were derived from accounts in the Torah itself. And one such story is told in Ezekiel chapter 1. And this is the one about the vision that Ezekiel has into the heavenly realms, where he sees God himself sitting upon a mystical four-wheeled chariot driven by strange creatures. Well, this Merkaba mysticism continues to be taught today. I've actually got a book, one of them, in my library. It's called The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life, and it was written by a man who calls himself Drunvalo Melchizedek. And it goes through some pretty unique beliefs, including histories of Atlantis and Lemuria, ancient mystery schools, and things like methods for creating one's own personal Merkaba, which is like a spiritual chariot that's shaped like an invisible tetrahedron made out of energy. Sacred geometry is also focused on in Merkaba teaching. Merkaba teaching really originated from the ancient Egyptian mystery schools. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that I personally endorse any particular views on these subjects, but I do enjoy researching alternative ideas, and I have to say that Merkaba mysticism is definitely a unique school of thought. One of the most notable philosophers, in fact, in all of history was Philo of Alexandria from Egypt, who lived from about 20 BC to 50 AD. He was Jewish. Philo taught that a richer understanding of God could be obtained by harmonizing the teachings of the Jewish Torah with Greek Hellenistic philosophy. Basically, he was trying to teach that to interpret everything in the Old Testament in a rigid, literal way would prevent mankind from really understanding God. He argued that God is far too complex to be understood just by rigid man-made explanations and scriptural interpretations. So he proposed a harmonized perspective that would allow men to transcend dogmatic understandings. Well, Philo promoted the Hellenistic philosophy of what was called logos, or reasoned wisdom. And another translation of logos is the word. That's what it means, the word. And that's exactly the term that's used by John, the apostle, who wrote that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, John naturally was one of the favorite writers of the early Christian Gnostics who held this mystic worldview. Gnosticism is not really unique to any particular religion. There were Jewish Gnostics, there were Greek Gnostics, Roman and pagan Gnostics. Gnosticism is more a philosophy that teaches that every human possesses in him a divine essence that is trapped in an earthly material form, and that this divine essence longs to be released from its physical captivity to return to its spiritual source, which is God, however one chooses to define God. And what liberates this spiritual essence from its, this captivity is called gnosis. Gnosis is a kind of special esoteric or mystical knowledge, a sacred wisdom. Greeks call it Sophia. It liberates the individual through his personal perception of and experience with the divine. Some early Christians also merged their religious faith with the practices of this Jewish mysticism from the Merkabah and Hekaloth traditions. Some of this Gnostic mysticism and secret spiritual initiation rites that were used by early Jewish Christians did so in an attempt to create kind of a special elite brotherhood within the Christian community that they believed would work to purify Israel and make the people a light to all the nations. And many early Christians of the first and second centuries, they interpreted the teachings of Jesus and his apostles through this lens of Gnosticism. They saw God as the source of all divine light, and that Jesus was God in human form, come to lead humanity back to the light through his teachings. Some of the writings of Paul to the Greeks, as well as some of the writings of John the Revelator, were viewed as Gnostic in nature by these early Christian groups. Of course, that's debatable, but that's their belief. These ancient Christian Gnostics wrote their own sacred texts, many of which were broadly distributed. They were widely read by the Christians of the first 3 centuries. And fortunately, many of these ancient texts have been preserved for us to look at today. I'll tell you that story real quick. In 1945, there were 2 brothers, both Egyptian farmers, who were living in the upper Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi. And they made an amazing discovery. They uncovered an ancient earthen jar that contained 13 leather-bound volumes that, with over 50 Gnostic texts from the first 2 centuries after the death of Jesus, they were in these volumes. And these texts were kept by Coptic Christians, which is a term for the early Christians of Egypt. I actually own an English translation of these Gnostic texts, which I've spent a little time reading to better understand. I've not read the whole thing, trying to better understand the teachings. And definitely these original Christian writings they're definitely Gnostic in nature. I think it's interesting to be able to look at some of the ancient texts that inform the beliefs of some of these earliest Christian communities. Certainly that's not representative of all the early Christians, but some of them. And again, not all Christians accepted these Gnostic writings. Remember that at the time, the Bible had not yet been canonized. It wasn't formed as we have it today. The early Christians, what they studied were a variety of writings. You had different groups of Christians and different geographical locations, and they would study certain texts that were not accepted as inspired by other groups of Christians elsewhere. They didn't have a set Bible yet. Pretty much all of the early church used the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. But the New Testament had not yet been assembled. Around the end of the 1st century AD, some of the letters of Paul were being distributed as small collections among churches. And in the early 2nd centuries, the texts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were being joined together in what was called the Memoirs of the Apostles, or the Tetramorph is the other thing they called it. And by the 3rd century, various groupings of these many writings had been assembled into early canons. A canon is a group of texts. Well, one of the main canons excluded the books of Esther, James, and some of the epistles of Peter and John, but included some books such as the Shepherd of Hermas, the book of Baruch, and the letter of Jeremiah. Over a period of 100 years, the Catholic Church gradually decided on a set canon. Any of the many Christian texts that the Catholic Church did not approve as canon, they were considered heretical. And those texts gradually fell out of favor with the general Christian population. But it should be noted that what texts were considered to be inspired biblical canon has never been cut and dry. Even the great reformer Martin Luther disagreed with the canon of scriptures of the Catholic Bible. He took 7 books out of the Old Testament and moved them into a new section of the Bible that he called the Apocrypha. And the books of the Apocrypha included Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the Book of Wisdom, Sirach, and Baruch. And these books are still considered inspired canon by Catholics today. Martin Luther also removed from the Bible the New Testament books of Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation. A lot of Protestants don't know that. Of course, most Protestants today do include those particular books in their Bibles. My point here is that to this day, there are various versions of the Bible used by different Christian sects around the world. The Bible, as most Western Protestants use today, is only one of many collections of ancient writings that people around the world today consider to be a Bible. Today, evangelical Christians will most certainly defend their canon of sacred texts as being the only true collection of writings, and they'll do so passionately. I'm sure some of you will tell me so in the comment section, but so too will the Lutherans defend their canon of biblical texts. And so will the Anglicans, who have a different set, the Roman Catholics, who have a slightly different set, the Slavonic Orthodox, the Armenian Apostolics, the Syriac Orthodox, the Coptics, and so on. Imagine the chaos if each of these Christian factions were to actually sit down in a conference room together to try to decide which group's set of scriptures is the right one and the only right one. Wouldn't that be a sight to behold? And if you can imagine such a scene, you can perhaps imagine the same kind of passionate disagreement over what constituted inspired texts among the early Christian groups. Clearly, these didn't make it into the later canon. But there is a main difference. Today, if a diverse group met to debate this matter and couldn't come to any agreement, they would probably just walk away agreeing to disagree, and that would be the end of it. But back in the early centuries, as the power of the Catholic Church became entwined with political power, those who disagreed with the positions of the Church could be branded as heretics and end up tied to tall stakes as flames danced about their legs. So it's no surprise that Christian Gnostics went into hiding. It was in the first decades of the 4th century that Emperor Constantine made Christianity a religio licta, or approved religion, and he convened the famous Council of Nicaea in 325 AD to try and put an end to the ongoing disputes between the various flavors of Christianity. Well, this had a significant impact in shaping future Christian theology, because after these political and religious bureaucrats made their compromises and voted on a set system of beliefs, anything on the fringes out here was considered heresy. And they actually enacted over 100 statutes that were written and aimed at these heretics. And this was also about consolidation of power by the elimination of the leaders of other strains of Christian thought. And it was around this time that this merging political and religious power was concentrated into the hands of the Bishop of Rome, who came to be known as the Father or the Pope. The Pope came to be recognized as having greater power and authority even than kings or emperors. And the Catholic Church began to target all of their rivals, both Christian and non-Christian alike. It went after the Greek mystery temples and other sacred sites to shut them down. It silenced the oracle at Delphi. If you don't know that, as early as 1400 BC, a line of pagan priestesses had functioned as highly sought-after prophets in Greece. So the Catholic Church put an end to that tradition. Really, any spiritual knowledge that was not already under the control of the Catholic Church was targeted and taken over. And as the centuries passed, the mystical and Gnostic lessons continued to be taught, but they were passed down through secret orders, through mystery schools, to hide them from the retribution of the Church. In 800 AD, Charlemagne of the Holy Roman Empire claimed to have descended from the biblical kings of Israel. But he wasn't the only one claiming succession. Charlemagne was one person in a group of families to claim to be direct descendants of 24 high priestly Jewish families that had fled Jerusalem around the time of its destruction in 70 AD. This group of privileged descendants were known as Rex Deus. Rex Deus. As Charlemagne extended control over his empire, he placed members of Rex Deus over the control of these territories to enable him to maintain control. By the time of his death, around 814 AD, much of Europe was under the control of these Rex Deus nobles. But what was not commonly known at that time was that these Rex Deus families were secretly Gnostics and therefore heretics. And much contemporary interest in the subject of course, arose from the highly successful and widely read novels by author Dan Brown, who wrote the Da Vinci Code. So if you want to prepare for our next episode, I'd recommend that you watch the movie which starred Tom Hanks, the Da Vinci Code movie. In my next episode, we are going to travel through the Dark Ages, following the development of mystery schools into powerful secret societies, including the infamous Knights Templar. For Blackstone Intelligence, I'm Jake Morphonios. Guys,